Greetings, friends. You're on NewsAder. I'm Alexander Kushner. Vitaly Portnikov from Ukraine is in touch with us. Greetings, Vitaly. Hello. Vitaly, Vladimir Zelensky has traveled a long way across the ocean. What do you think he achieved as a result of this visit and a 2-hour conversation with Donald Trump alone? But we cannot know what the president's conversation was about, but at least we can hope that Vladimir Zelensky was able to outline the Ukrainian vision of how peace negotiations should take place, and what the position of the civilized world should be in communication with Vladimir Putin. We are well aware that Donald Trump's meeting with Vladimir Zelensky could not but be influenced by his conversation with the Russian president. We saw that even in the open part of this meeting, Trump expressed confidence that this time he and Putin would be able to come to an agreement. But we do not know the most interesting thing: on what facts this confidence is based, and on what conditions Donald Trump is going to negotiate with the Russian leader. That is, we have complete ignorance about this, despite the fact that Donald Trump behaves as if he knows something for sure. But does he really know, or is it just, let's say, a continuation of attempts to put pressure on Putin, without actually having anything new behind his back? Well, we know that Trump is a fairly confident person, and if he doesn't know something, he invents his knowledge. At least, we have absolutely indisputable facts that say that after pressure on the Kremlin, Putin himself initiated a conversation with Donald Trump, and during this conversation, agreed to the possibility of a bilateral meeting of the presidents. Moreover, we are well aware that it is unlikely that Trump will agree to a new inconclusive meeting. He already has Anchorage experience. And most importantly, it's not even about the experience of Anchorage, but about the experience of the reaction to Anchorage, of American media, American public opinion. Because almost everyone from conservatives and liberals, from Trump supporters to his implacable opponents, agreed with the indisputable truth that it was a fiasco of the American president and a diplomatic victory of the Russian one. Yes, Putin was not the person in Anchorage who managed to get some decisions from Trump. Yes, he was not escorted off as solemnly as he was greeted. Yes, an irritated Trump flew away from Alaska without even having dinner or having lunch with the Russian delegation there. But this does not remove the question from the agenda: but why was such an unprepared meeting needed at all? And therefore, Trump, of course, will not want another such unprepared meeting. But I would still like us to restore, if you like, a certain sequence of mutual pressure. The meeting in Anchorage, the lack of any progress, Putin's massive bombing of Ukraine. The goal is to destroy the country's energy gas-producing infrastructure. Putin's drones in the airspace of European countries, Trump's threat to supply Ukraine with new weapons, including Tomahawk missiles. China's threat to impose restrictions on the supply of rare earth metals necessary for the production of American weapons, including these very Tomahawk missiles. Trump's threat to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese products if China does not abandon these restrictions from November. Putin's call to Trump, with Trump's offer to meet in Budapest and talk about the economy if Russia's war with Ukraine ends. By the way, this economy may also include the development of Russian rare earth metals. Well, the culmination, so to speak, the rose on this cake, is the idea of a tunnel from Chukotka to Alaska, which was proposed by Kirill Dmitry and picked up by Donald Trump, who, as we know, generally loves a large-scale project. Here we are now. Okay, but what do you think Putin will do in this situation? Because he also understands that Trump will not be satisfied if he leaves empty-handed again, will raise his voice again, will tear up and throw right there, will refuse to finish. Putin doesn't need it either, because Putin has to offer something. Trump, what can he offer? Again, the best question is not even about the meeting. The fact is that it seems to me that the proposals should be agreed upon already at the meeting of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov with United States Secretary of State Mark Ruby, or during their telephone conversation there. There must be some real document that the parties can sign or at least discuss in Budapest. And this document should be drafted in such a way that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky agrees with it. Because Trump said that the Ukrainian president will be in touch during this summit in Budapest. It is obvious that the Russian president is not going to meet with his Ukrainian counterpart. I don't think such a meeting will happen at all. But nevertheless, it is clear that without taking into account the opinion of Ukraine, Trump will also not be able to agree with Putin, as without taking into account the opinion of Israel. Even with the intense pressure he exerted on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Trump could not agree with Hamas. And with the sponsors of Hamas in the Arab world. In other words, you believe that they will agree on something, and then there will be a meeting, or they will not agree on anything. And the meeting may not take place. That's right. It is quite possible that they will not agree on anything, and the meeting in Budapest will become a phantom. In general, Budapest as such. You understand, this is also an attempt by Trump to unite the issue of ending the Russian-Ukrainian war, with the help of his favorite far-right Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who is now facing the prospect of losing power in Hungary. His party is now 10 percentage points behind the opposition in opinion polls. And Trump, as an arrogant person, can count on his arrival in Budapest to help Orban get a kind of second wind in his election campaign, look like a prime minister of the world, a mediator in concluding agreements between the United States and Russia, world politicians. In this way, Orban will once again be able to continue to rule Hungary and fill the pockets of his supporters, firm the power structures. In this sense, Trump has an absolutely obvious desire, because he generally tries to support populist far-right, marginal politicians around the world, and with the help of money. You know that the economic myth of the Argentine populist president Javier Nasser is collapsing now, as it should have happened with a person who hardly understands what the real economy looks like. Well, for several months there he managed to hold out on some such, I would say, classic populist measures and promises. Now everything is collapsing. Nasser can at any moment turn out to be, one might say, buried under the ruins of its economic inventions. And everyone understands this very well in America. And he successfully lost the local elections. I hope that it will continue to lose, and continue until its collapse. And Trump is already saying that he will not be so generous to Argentina if the Argentinian is not supported by Nasser. It's the same in Brazil, where, as you can see, he supports another marginal Bolsonaro. And in this sense, the Budapest meeting may also be such an important milestone for Trump to support Orban. But the question is, what should he do if it turns out that this meeting will not bring results? Well, do you think Putin is now showing at least a single sign that he wants to stop on Trump's terms? And Trump said yesterday, I want the parties to stop where they stand. That is, again, where they stand is what he said from day one. Yes. Well, look, what is Putin's situation? There is Putin's formula. He needs the Trump presidency to be about maintaining the status quo. In fact, the situation froze after Trump appeared in the Oval Office. Trump does not impose new sanctions against the Russian Federation. Why introduce them? It is possible to frighten Putin and prevent future economic cooperation between Russia and the United States. And Trump does not give any quality to Ukraine's new weapons. Yes, there is an initiative that allows European countries to buy American weapons from American companies. But, as we understand, even these purchases are not comparable to the assistance that Ukraine received from the administration of Joseph Biden. It can't even be compared. It would be a shame to compare it in terms of volumes and capabilities. I didn't say that. That means Putin is satisfied in principle. No serious new weapons, no new sanctions against Russia. And I think it is in this state, I would say in the refrigerator, that he would like to keep Trump all the time he is in the Oval Office. But Trump is constantly trying to get out of the refrigerator when he sees that staying in this cryogenic sleep interferes with his reputation. And now there are threats against China. For example, 500% duties if China continues to buy Russian oil. Yes, and we understand that no one in Beijing will give up Russian oil, but there may be some concessions. Some negotiations with the Americans. Let's buy here and not buy here. Well, that is, it can all happen at Putin's expense. And, of course, tomahawks. The very idea of a tomahawk suggests that the United States, in order to force Putin to meet Trump's conditions, can go to Ukraine to provide the quality of new weapons, which, yes, may not radically change the course of the war, but will deprive Putin of several oil refineries or military-industrial enterprises, which he, too, naturally would like to avoid. Well, in this case, Putin just picks up the phone and calls Trump, and very simply tells him that all Trump wants is to hear compliments. Donald, you're great, you're amazing. How did you handle everything in the Middle East? How did you cope with everything in the South Caucasus? In other words, he behaves with him not even as an investigator with a follow-up, but as an adult with a small child, who just needs to be calmed down. Well, he calmed him down for the time of the meeting with Zelensky. It is clear that there could be no question of any serious arms supplies at this meeting. It is clear that there could be no question of any new sanctions against Russia. And Trump, by the way, when journalists reminded him before the meeting with Zelensky that the Senate was considering new sanctions against Russia, said, "But they don't know about my conversation with Putin. This is not the time." Well, that is, Putin has once again achieved this result, but for how long? How long will he be able to lead Trump by the nose and give Trump the opportunity not to use any new measures against Russia, if he himself does not take any concrete steps? That's the most interesting question. I'm still interested in a purely technical question. So this conversation on the eve of Trump's meeting with Zelensky between Trump and Putin, did it take place on whose initiative? On Putin's initiative. In other words, Putin himself wanted to call Trump. So Putin felt that his situation was getting worse. In order to prevent any possible agreements between Trump and Zelensky. Well, look, before Trump's conversation with Putin, Trump talked to Zelensky twice on the phone. But Putin can't help but understand that if people talk twice in a row, it means they are discussing some real solutions. They don't talk about the weather every day. Yes. So it is necessary to prevent any real decisions that could be discussed at the meeting of the president. But now he did it. There is a result. All right. So it's all on Putin's initiative. Putin feels that his position is weakening. That's the key point. What do you think he will offer Trump? Firm the phantasms. What other illusions? Because it will certainly offer illusions. He won't offer anything real. I don't have it in this. I don't think Putin thinks he is weaker. I think he believes that Trump is getting out of the fridge and can disrupt the status quo. This is not a question of Putin's weakness. It's a question of Trump's willingness to move firm words to actions. And Putin needs to deter Trump from any actions that could prevent the Russian Federation from continuing the war against Ukraine in the coming years. Because this is a simple plan to bring the war to 2029 year, exhausting Ukraine, and negotiate its surrender with the next president of the United States. That's it. Because this one is unlikely to agree, but it can create conditions for surrender. Simply put, Donald Trump's political task in the eyes of Vladimir Putin is to create conditions for the surrender of Ukraine. That's it. Something like Trump's task in the eyes of Qatar is to create conditions so that Hamas, after the strategic mistake that was made by the terrorists, their sponsors on October 7, 2023, could regain its position, strengthen itself, recreate the tunnel, and get new weapons. Recruit new fighters, maybe under other names, and so on. And prepare for more effective actions to destabilize the destruction of the Jewish state. That's all that Trump needs, relatively speaking, the Emir of Qatar, the President of Russia. But Trump is moving in that direction. Qatar has already received what Putin wanted now. Got it? Yes. Let's hope that Israel will be more farsighted and understand the essence of what is happening. And Putin is not yet getting what he wanted either. In this regard, I recall how Trump repeatedly called Zelensky the best air seller in history. But the air seller actually turns out to be Putin. Because he will. The seller of air is definitely Putin, because Zelensky asked for help in connection with real problems. Zelensky doesn't sell any air. The best seller in the history of the air, and the best Trump deceiver in history, is of course, Putin. A man who brilliantly leads Trump by the nose throughout the entire period of Trump's tenure as President of the United States. And wins over Trump one victory after another. But there is one but. Trump himself wants to be defeated by Putin. He himself climbs into all the traps that Putin sets, he himself agrees with all the nonsense that Putin offers. Trump himself wants to be fooled because he is an ideological ally of another far-right leader. They are ideologically close. And this ideological closeness of theirs will make Trump a person susceptible to the air that Putin sells. But there is another problem. It really can't go on indefinitely. If it were 2028th year now, of course, the latter could have been like this until the end of his political career. But in 2025th year, he will not succeed. And indeed, you are absolutely right. Or there will be a refusal to meet in Budapest, an exit to a new circle with a new blackmail. And with a new conversation about tomahawks or something else. Either Putin will have to agree to something or demonstrate something. Yes, I'm still just trying to figure out what kind of air he will sell to Trump this time. I'm thinking, what kind of air he sold? I think he promised him to negotiate for rare earth metals. Economy. The United States has not been so dependent on China. And the idea of a tunnel from Chukotka to Alaska is something like this by Kirill Dmitrievich, I do not know. It's just not some kind of mustache, you know. This is a vivid example of how he works with Trump. In other words, look what we get. Nothing changes in Ukraine. Putin has bombed Ukraine, and will continue to, but there is a common economic project, even if it is purely virtual, yes. That's how the idea that is being discussed. But this will stop Trump from making sharp moves against the Kremlin. Yes, because Putin can save him from China if anything, but it is only necessary to agree with Putin on Ukraine. But as it is necessary, it means just to be patient and convince him that such agreements will be good for the path itself. You said that the arms supplies that are coming from Trump to Ukraine cannot even be compared with what was from Biden. I just wanted to say, just to remind you that Biden gave for free, Trump sells, but even as he sells, it already looks very, very strange. Look, Pete Hegseth held this summit, or rather, he participated in the NATO summit, where he said that here we have a pearl. Please participate, no one should shirk. Okay, please tell me what really happened at this summit of NATO defense ministers. In general, NATO heard Pete Hegseth. Pearl will really work but it works, more and more new countries are connected. But you can see that the Europeans can raise much less money than the Americans could offer her in Ukraine. Just a different level of financial supply. If you think Putin doesn't notice it, he notices it all. That's why he's happy with it all. Let there be such a program, let the Europeans spend money, empty their own budgets. In any case, this will not dramatically affect the situation at the front. But tomahawks, that's if the Americans themselves start acting something. That's if Trump starts behaving like Biden, that's bad. It's necessary to talk about the tunnel to Alaska. I don't think Trump, in principle, can behave like Biden because he is not free, he delivers for a fee. That's the thing. What is Pearl is America sells weapons to Europe. European countries choose either to spend on their defense industry or on the American one. I'm sorry, but why should they spend on American if they have their own and the only sense? When the Americans are ready to sell their exclusive, long-range missiles to some critical weapons. But that's exactly what Trump is not selling. It is on this that he imposes a de facto embargo. That's the thing. Why then? Well, maybe there is something American that the Europeans don't produce, or they can't produce quickly, they can buy it. But in principle, the model itself is that the Europeans should raise military budgets and buy American weapons, at the expense of this increase. In exchange, so to speak, for America's nuclear umbrella, which is unknown or will be revealed. This is also largely the sale of air and robbery. And here is the reaction of the White House in this regard. Caroline Leavitt, a spokeswoman, says that the White House has lost patience and wants the parties to end this war as soon as possible. Tell me, who is she addressing here at all? To Zelensky. I think it doesn't matter what the White House press secretary says. But it is the White House press secretary who is promoting the image of Trump, who want to see the voters of the American president. Let's say the core of Trump. Here Trump will lose patience and everyone will agree. Trump will not lose patience and no one will agree. We understand that, in general, political and economic processes do not develop in this way. Well, again, if Trump is losing patience and wants everyone to agree, let him explain what real tools he has to influence Putin. Real. In other words, is Putin really ready to negotiate peace in connection with tomahawks? And just the tomahawk situation forces him to work with Trump like a fakir with a cobra. Here's the question. We, too, do not fully understand what caused Putin's call. You say that Putin is weakening, but I believe that Putin just wants to keep Trump from any sudden movements. He just wants to leave Trump in a static position. Therefore, I am ready to call for this. It's hard for him to call and talk for 2.5 hours. But he was trained for it. This meeting at the NATO summit, right? How do you like her? In other words, are these signs of the return of at least a partial us to Europe in this sense? Or is this again pure rhetoric, not yet backed up by actions? What is it? So far, everything that comes from the Trump administration is pure rhetoric, not backed up action. A disaster. Because there will be real actions if they take some kind of decision to implement their threats. And when it is said in almost plain text that we are not talking about tomahawks in order to scare Putin and force him to sit down at the negotiating table, then we must assume that Putin himself is a complete idiot, and he will be afraid of words. Do you understand that Putin reacts exactly to actions? Yes, he wants to prevent the possibility of implementing words, turning words into action. He then does something. But I don't think it's a question of fear, because it's a question of just an elementary political reaction. You and I too, if we were faced with some kind of threat, even if we did not believe that it was feasible. But we would try to talk to the person who threatens us in order to understand in general how to calm him down. And so that he would throw these thoughts out of his head altogether. In this sense, Europe is also very concerned, but for her, yes, in fact, she projects on herself how Trump treats Ukraine. Because it turns out that Trump will not protect Europe either. Let's imagine a war, a limited conflict, whatever. Trump calls Putin, they agree. Trump says, let's stop where we are, and Russian troops have already occupied Suwalkovsky. I'll meet you in Budapest. And in Budapest, yes. Yes. But I will tell you, if the United States and Turkey are neutral with respect to what is happening in Europe, if Russia commits some kind of attack, even a limited one, on NATO countries, it will mean that European countries and Russia have almost military technological parity if Russia has more people who can be mobilized. This is not a question of the number of people, as you understand, but a question of the number of people ready to fight. That is, and at the moment, do you think that Trump has calmed the Europeans, or vice versa? Has made them even more worried about their future of this story, when it is so easy, Trump, to turn in the other direction with one call literally? Of course, I think he made them more worried, especially the fact that he is arranging a meeting with Putin in Budapest, in the capital of one of the European countries, even without trying to agree on a meeting place with his European partners simply because he wanted to. This also says a lot about the attitude towards Europe, towards European allies, right? And when Trump's press secretary answered the question, a reasonable question from a journalist, and who in general could have thought of meeting in Budapest in this way, he says, your mother invented it. Yes, this once again speaks about the intellectual and political level of this whole team. They don't even understand the consequences of one or another of Trump's steps. Or maybe they understand it well and believe that this is exactly the way to act. That is, humiliating their strategic allies. Humiliating his strategic allies, it shows that Trump can behave in world politics like an elephant in a china shop. And how do the Europeans react to this story, in your opinion, that without them, as usual, they are trying to calm Trump down, in order to somehow get him on the right track? We can see what's going on. They turn it around all the time, you know. Here they turn, as it was once with Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, who was brought to some event when he was already seriously ill. And he was going the wrong way, and he was being turned. Well, that's about the same thing happening with Trump. Trump, of course, goes in the right directions, although not always. Well, this is generally a problem of American politics of the last, I would say, years. It's not just Trump's problem, it was a problem with Biden and others that this gerontological policy has become. Here, but it's not about gerontology, but the fact that they are trying to turn it around politically all the time. It is absolutely no coincidence that Zelensky spoke with European leaders immediately after the meeting with Trump. It was exactly this conversation, my God, but what is it that's what to do now? Again, he doesn't understand where he is at all. Well, I don't think Zelensky told them that, but everyone understands the essence of this conversation perfectly. By the way, the fact that Finnish President Alexander Stupa was a participant in it, yes. The head of not the largest country in the European Union, but a person capable of talking to Trump, let's say. Some kind of cash in some kind of personal communication. Well, able to play golf with him, relatively speaking. It is also obvious that they just need to drag Trump away from the illusion of mutual understanding with Putin once again. Although I will tell you again, Sasha, I do not think that at the same time, Trump has no opportunity to agree with Putin on a conditional ceasefire along the demarcation line. Because if Putin believes that Trump will violate the status quo anyway, he will most likely go for such a termination. And if Putin believes that his arsenal and verbal influence on Trump has been exhausted, then he will not risk violating the status quo. You understand that some new serious sanctions, for example, against Russia's energy sponsors, are not in Putin's interests. Because they will be told from Beijing, but actually that maybe you will somehow stop for a while. So that we do not receive 500% of tariffs and do not lose economic some possibilities. Well, the same goes for the Tomahawk. It is better to prevent the supply of some kind of weapons to Ukraine that can destroy naphtha refining than oil refining. So that it will have to be restored for years. This will not oblige Putin to anything, as well as Hamas, do you understand? It's not going to be some kind of agreement that won't allow Putin to return to the war there in a year or two. But such a truce along the line of demarcation, again, if Trump achieves it, it can allow there to overload the power in Ukraine. Putin will have hope that maybe he will strengthen the positions of some forces here, which will be able to go with him to some new agreements. And again, that the election campaign itself may destabilize Ukraine. He may have different introductory notes. But again, this is in the event that Putin really thinks the way I suggest to you. Putin's desire to get everything at once may fail him once again, and we will again go into a new circle with threats. And maybe even with the implementation of some threats. Well, Vitaly, finally, yes, we have repeatedly talked about Budapest. But Budapest is also a symbol of the failed First Budapest, yes, the 94th year, it seems. According to which Russia violated the Budapest Memorandum, don't you think that? Well, I don't know, consciously, unconsciously, we all go into this same pit again. Well, we always go in circles in world politics when we don't want to respond adequately to dangers. Yes, I also believe that any Budapest agreements, they do not guarantee anything, because there is such a good poll, which, by the way, Zelensky asked Trump even during their meeting. And what about the security guarantees? What will the security guarantees look like? Here's how you can guarantee that Russia will not start a war against Ukraine again. Now Trump is saying again, if Hamas does not stop killing people in Gaza, we will go there and kill Hamas. Well, it is clear that no one will enter Gaza now, I mean the Israeli army, in order to protect the residents of the enclave themselves from Hamas. Although this is also an interesting point, because it turns out that those people who opposed Hamas, hoping that Hamas would be purged from Gaza, are now simply being killed and destroyed. And the next time there is a campaign against Hamas, of course, no one will think of opposing Hamas, because everyone will understand that all these generous promises, and even help with weapons. You know that now Hamas has seized the weapons of all these clans that opposed it, and these weapons could be supplied from outside. There you go. It is clear that all this does not work, that it is better to sit quietly and not think about overthrowing the Hamas leader, because everything will end with execution. But this is only the first stage of the story. Then there may already be some new action against Israel. And if it is, let's say, an action not of Hamas, but of some Islamic jihad, that it will make it easier for someone. And Hamas will say, and we generally support peace, and we simply cannot control these radicals at all. Because Israel destroyed our communications, which allowed us to control everything so well, but here's the answer to the question. And since there's one more question about Hamas. What will happen next right now in the Gaza Strip, when a bunch of destitute people will lose their homes? They may just become easy prey for Hamas as those who can be recruited against Israel, a new round of terror of a new round. I'll tell you a secret, Alexander. These people were easy prey until the 7th of October, 2023 year. Because everything possible was done anyway to make them destitute. And the Hamas, and the Qataris, and in general, the Arab countries that sponsored Hamas and Iran. You remember that there was always the idea that real money can be obtained only if you send your son to explode at a disco. There was always a lot of money, but it went to weapons in the tunnel, so everyone says, this is how. And what kind of tunnel system Hamas built under the Gaza Strip? It doesn't compare to how Israel is building a high-speed tram there in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, so I'm sorry. Israel, building a high-speed tram, it also uses taxpayers' money for some social needs, for a lot of infrastructure projects. For the army, for the 5th, for the 10th. And people in Israel do not live the same way as in the Gaza Strip. And in the Gaza Strip, yes, I used the money that was given in the form of humanitarian aid to the unfortunate Palestinians to build tunnels, buy weapons and explosives. Therefore, these people, when they became explosives or some of their children became explosives, they received money because it was money for explosives. That's the whole story. And now, of course, now the situation is even more catastrophic. Because it's not just easy stuff now, as these people were before the 7th of October, 2023 year. These are still people, an overwhelming sense of revenge, which can be channeled quite correctly, naturally, towards Israel, not Hamas. So that the Jews destroy your loved ones, the Jews kill your brother, the Jews destroy their house, your house. Many of those who tried to avenge, you were killed by Jews, join our ranks. By the way, it may not necessarily be Hamas now, because Hamas may look like an organization that has failed to take revenge. And then the banners will be raised by more extremist organizations, such as Islamic Jihad, for example. This organization can oust Hamas from the battlefield and become an even more brutal and implacable enemy of the Jewish state. And what will happen in the territory left by Hamas? There will be preparations for a new war, now accompanied by anti-Semitic demonstrations in European countries, and running around with Palestinian flags under the hooting of useful idiots. It reminds me of the Russian situation, in fact, that Putin, like Hamas, uses his people as biological weapons, and often uses these revenge motives, resentment motives. Prilpin spoke out here saying that we have many graves and the Europeans are to blame for this. Do you understand? Yes, which in no way give us the opportunity to comfortably defeat Ukraine and kill them all, but the Europeans are to blame. Yes, because the Americans are now giving us more opportunities to do this, but the Europeans are not giving the bastards. All right, Vitaly, thank you very much for this conversation. This is the kind of world we have to live in, dealing with those who want to take revenge for the fact that they are not allowed to cannibalize so much on such a scale as they initially wanted. Thank you. See you soon.